But so, the town turns automac to warple. Send the sign or in I crane.
In October 1966, the U.S. Department of Defense conducted a test. They flew aircraft over Laos without telling the Laotian government. They seeded clouds. And it worked so well that a State Department memo later admitted the results were too successful. So successful that one seeding run dumped 9 inches of rain on a U.S. Special Forces camp in 4 hours, and the rainfall spread so far and wide that nobody could predict where it would stop. By January 1967, the same people writing those memos were asking each other, should we do this on purpose, for months at a time, across an entire country we're supposedly allied with? And if we do, if we actually weaponize the weather, who pays the price? What happens when a government discovers it can change the sky, and nobody else knows it's happening? Let's look at what they actually put in writing. On January 13, 1967, Foy Kohler, Deputy Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, sent a memo to Secretary of State Dean Rusk. The subject line, Weather Modification in North Vietnam and Laos, Project Popeye. Kohler wasn't speculating. He was responding to a formal request from the Department of Defense to move from testing into operational deployment. By that point, the test phase had already happened. In October 1966, without informing Laotian authorities, though with Ambassador Sullivan's knowledge, the U.S. military had flown more than 50 cloud seeding missions over the Sekong River Valley in southern Laos. The results were documented. 82% of the seeded clouds produced rain, the roads became impassable, and the memo itself contains this remarkable line. The experiments were so successful, officials worried they were too successful. Nobody could predict where the rain would stop once it started. Here's what we need to understand about the timing. The U.S. was losing in Vietnam. Not militarily, not yet, but politically. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply line running through Laos from North Vietnam into the south, was working. Trucks were moving. Troops were moving. The bombing campaign wasn't stopping them. So the military looked at what they had: advanced aircraft, classified research budgets, and a willingness to try something that hadn't been done before in warfare. Cloud seeding itself wasn't new. Scientists had been experimenting with it since the 1940s. But weaponizing it, using it as a deliberate tool to render an entire country's transportation network useless, that was new. And the people writing these memos knew it. Kohler's memo doesn't just describe a military tactic. It walks through the political catastrophe waiting if anyone found out. It discusses crop damage. It discusses the psychological effect on civilians when rain falls in the wrong season. It even predicts that if exposure happened, people would blame the U.S. for unrelated weather disasters, floods, droughts, anything unusual, because once the secret got out, the damage to American credibility would be total. And yet the operation went ahead. Not immediately. Rusk approved a modified, limited version on a strictly experimental basis, but the modification was bureaucratic theater. By 1968, Operation Popeye was running sustained missions. By 1972, the Pentagon would declassify figures showing 600 seeding missions across Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, dropping a total of 409 canisters of silver iodide and other compounds. That's not an experiment. That's a sustained campaign. The operation remained classified for 7 years. When it finally became public in 1974, buried in the Pentagon Papers, there was outrage. Congress held hearings. And in 1975, barely a year after exposure, the U.S. and Soviet Union negotiated the Environmental Modification Convention, which banned military use of weather modification techniques with widespread, long-lasting, or severe effects. The U.S. signed it, ratified it unanimously in the Senate, 98-0, on November 28, 1979. The message was clear: we did this. We regret it. Never again. Systems don't panic. They adjust. The 1967 Kohler memo describes the test phase results. 82% of the clouds seeded produced rain within a brief period after seeding, a percentage appreciably higher than normal expectation in the absence of seeding. That's the statistical foundation. But then it gets specific about what this means operationally. The amount of rainfall induced by seeding is believed to have been sufficient to have contributed substantially to rendering vehicular routes in this area inoperable. Since the end of the rainy season, the communists have failed to undertake route repairs, and there has been no vehicular traffic. So the test worked. Roads stayed broken. Trucks didn't move, and the memo doesn't hide the uncontrolled element. In one instance, the rainfall continued as the cloud moved eastward across the Vietnam border, and inundated a U.S. Special Forces camp with 9 inches of rain in 4 hours. They seeded clouds over Laos intending to disrupt enemy supply lines. The rain kept falling. It crossed a border, it hit their own people, and they still approved expanding it. Now here's what the Kohler memo says about the legal and moral dimension. There are thus legal and perhaps moral or philosophical aspects to the question whether the U.S. should utilize the capability we seem to have developed to alter weather conditions significantly. We cannot lightly assume responsibility for unilaterally altering climate and possibly landforms in other sovereign entities, and particularly for initiating weather warfare with an uncertain extent of injury to civilian populations. That's 1967. The people writing this knew what they were doing, had no legal precedent, they knew it was weather warfare, they knew civilians would be harmed. And then, this is the part that matters, they recommended approval anyway. The memo says, with respect to Laos, Ambassador Sullivan has approved the project and indicated he would not plan to consult Prime Minister Suvarnabhumi, our ally. We weren't going to tell him. The math balances, but the logic doesn't. The memo also anticipated the public relations catastrophe. One probable consequence is that many Lao and Thai might immediately attribute to U.S. experimentation the disastrous Mekong flood of September 1966. More irrationally, and perhaps with less certainty, there might be many occasions in which uninformed groups in non-communist as well as communist nations would blame the U.S. for climatic abnormalities with which we had no connection. So they knew, once people found out, they'd blame us for tinus every bad weather event, and they were willing to absorb that reputational damage as a cost of doing business. The memo concludes, it seems highly unlikely that such operations could remain secret indefinitely, and our assumption should be that they will become known. They weren't trying to keep it secret forever. They were just trying to keep it secret long enough. But here's where the two narratives diverge. The Kohler memo from 1967 treats cloud seeding as a proven technique ready for military deployment. The scientific history tells a different story. The BBC article on Project Storm Fury, the parallel U.S. effort to weaken hurricanes using similar cloud seeding methods, documents decades of failure and self-deception. On Hurricane Esther in 1961, the article says, on a radar instrument monitoring Esther, U.S. Weather Bureau planes detected a weakening of the eye wall. Despite other checks showing no change, it was declared a success. One instrument said it worked, everything else said nothing happened. They called it a success anyway. Then comes Hurricane Debbie in 1969, where the article reports the data was jaw-dropping. Winds decreased by 31% and 15% on the seeding days. The director concluded there was less than a 1 in 10 chance of this happening naturally. But by the early 1970s, researchers realized that hurricanes naturally develop multiple eye walls without any seeding at all. What they thought was proof of the technique working might have just been weather being weather. The BBC article is very clear about the institutional pressure. It says, because of the project's military value and potential impact on civilian safety, Storm Fury received millions of dollars in funding and support that most meteorological studies can only imagine. At the same time, hurricane science was still in its infancy, with not enough known to make accurate predictions about their interior structure and behavior. So we had military demand, massive funding, and minimal actual knowledge. The article quotes the Navy's project leader, Pierre Street Amand, saying the experiment began at the wrong end. They started with a military objective and worked backward to the science, and when the science didn't cooperate, they found ways to read success into ambiguity. The final evaluation, written by meteorologist Hugh Willoughby in 1985, concluded, despite the team's determined efforts, the expected results of seeding are often indistinguishable from naturally occurring intensity changes, which is another way of saying, we don't know if it worked. We never did. And this is crucial. The article reveals that Storm Fury provided cover for Popeye. Harper, the historian quoted in the BBC piece, says, the Navy had a secret program out at China Lake Naval Air Station, where they were working on seeding techniques or weather control techniques that were going to be used in Laos in Vietnam. And then, for these efforts, a civilian program to research weather modification would provide the perfect cover. So the hurricane weakening research, the public-facing, ostensibly peaceful meteorology, was a front. The real work was weapons development happening in classified military facilities. The Kohler memo from 1967 never mentions Storm Fury. The hurricane research is separate, official, published in scientific journals. But the BBC article tells us they were the same people, the same techniques, the same budget architecture. One was cover for the other. The military got to develop and deploy weather warfare, while the civilian program published peer-reviewed papers about hurricane modification. Systems don't panic, they adjust. Here's what the sources actually show. Operation Popeye was not a secret military program hiding in the shadows. It was a fully documented, formally authorized, legally reviewed decision made by the State Department to deploy weather modification as a weapon against a civilian population in a country the U.S. was not at war with, and to do so without that country's knowledge or consent. This wasn't rogue actors. This wasn't a cover-up that succeeded until 1974. This was institutional machinery working exactly as designed. A formal memo from a Deputy Undersecretary of State to the Secretary of State, discussing legal implications, civilian casualties, and diplomatic fallout, and then recommending approval anyway. The people making this decision knew it was unprecedented. They knew it was illegal under emerging international law. They knew it would harm civilians. And they did it because the military benefits, slowing truck traffic on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, were worth the cost. That's the thesis. Not that America committed a war crime in secret, that America committed a war crime on paper, debated it, and authorized it. Now, the strongest objection to this argument is that the Kohler memo ultimately recommended approval with conditions, limited areas, monitoring, consultation with allies, public affairs preparation. It wasn't a blank check. It was a modified proposal. And one could argue that this demonstrates the system dorking asterisk. Officials identified serious problems, proposed safeguards, and attempted to constrain the damage. The memo itself reads like institutional restraint. Kohler's personal note at the top says, "I have serious doubts." Rusk had reservations. They approved it strictly on an experimental basis. This looks like people in power saying no to the worst-case scenario. And if you're generous, you could say that's true. They did reject the widest deployment and tried to narrow the scope. But here's the problem with that reading. The narrowing was theater. The conditions were never enforced. By 1972, the Pentagon had dropped 47 409 canisters across 600 missions in 3 countries. The experimental basis became sustained industrial-scale warfare. The consultation with Suvarnabhumi never happened. The monitoring reports that were supposed to go to state got buried. Systems don't panic, they adjust. The deeper problem is that the restraint was built into the language itself. Look at the memo's phrasing. It proposes to exclude areas of relatively heavy population, but then it acknowledges that the target areas in Laos are characterized by relatively low population density. So low population areas don't need protection. The calculation is already baked in. We can do this here because not many people live there. The memo also notes that the increased rainfall will inhibit military movement more than civilian movement. Excellent. So civilians will be harmed less. Except that's not actually true, and the memo admits it. The impact on civilian population will be much the same, in kind and greater in degree, than that discussed below with respect to areas outside the target zones. So civilians will suffer more damage than military targets. The memo acknowledges this and recommends proceeding anyway. The safeguards weren't designed to prevent harm. They were designed to manage it, to make it tolerable to policymakers, to distribute blame. That's not restraint, that's infrastructure for harm. And this is where the Storm Fury history matters. The cloud seeding technique itself was junk science. The Kohler memo treats it as proven. But the BBC article shows that even in the one apparent success, Hurricane Debby in 1969, researchers later realized they were probably seeing natural variation. They declared victory on ambiguous evidence because the XCs wanted Summit to declare victory. The military needed a weather weapon. The scientists had a weather weapon. Nobody asked hard questions about whether it actually worked. When it didn't work on hurricanes, the program got shut down. But when it was deployed on Laos, there was no requirement for it to work on the science, just on the strategy. And here's the thing. Even if the technique was useless, it didn't matter. Laos got rained on. Crops failed. Roads washed out. Civilians were displaced or died. The rain fell regardless of whether we could actually predict or control it. The mechanism might have been pseudoscience, but the harm was real. That's the final layer. You can debate whether weather modification actually works, but you cannot debate whether dropping experimental compounds on a civilian population and intensifying rainfall causes damage. The math balances, but the logic doesn't. But the real scandal isn't just what was done, it's the speed at which it was normalized and then formally prohibited. In 1967, Popeye was approved. By 1972, it was operating across Southeast Asia at industrial scale. By 1974, the Pentagon Papers exposed it. By 1975, the US and Soviet Union were negotiating the Environmental Modification Convention. By 1979, the Senate ratified it 98-0. That's 12 years from authorization to universal prohibition. Why? Because everyone understood what had happened. The US deployed weather warfare. It worked or didn't work. Doesn't matter, the effect was the same. And once you open that door, you can't control who walks through it. The memo itself predicted this. At some future time, in some as yet unforeseen way, this could prove to be militarily disadvantageous to the US. So the treaty was prophylactic. Not an admission of wrongdoing, but a circuit breaker. We did this once. We're never doing it again. Because if everyone else does it too, we lose. The treaty wasn't built on principle. It was built on fear. And that's the real indictment. The only thing that stopped weather warfare wasn't moral reasoning or international law. It was the calculation that the precedent would eventually come back to bite us. Systems don't panic. They adjust. Operation Popeye reveals something about how institutional power actually works that's more important than any single war crime. The decision to deploy weather modification as a weapon wasn't made in darkness. It was debated. Legal implications were reviewed. Moral concerns were documented. Civilian casualties were discussed. And then it was authorized anyway, not despite all that knowledge, but with full awareness of it. The Kohler memo didn't hide the problem. It contains the problem. It turned moral objection into bureaucratic process. It turned legal uncertainty into a decision framework. It transformed the question, should we do this, into how do we do this responsibly? And once you've answered the second question, the first one disappears. This is how systems function. Not by denying wrongdoing, by acknowledging it and proceeding, by admitting the cost and paying it anyway because someone calculated that the benefit was worth it. You cannot appeal to conscience against an institution that has already consulted its conscience and decided conscience is manageable. That's the real horror. Not cruelty that hides, cruelty that knows itself and continues. So what should you do with this? Don't read it as history. Read it as infrastructure. The tools haven't changed. Neither has the logic. You're watching it happen now. There's no storm of declassified memos coming. There's no Pentagon Papers moment. The operations you should be concerned about are classified under authorities that haven't yet been challenged legally. Drone strikes with uncertain civilian counts, surveillance programs justified by shifting threat assessments, research into biological and artificial intelligence capabilities that exists in the gap between discovery and regulation. The Popeye memo exists because courts and Congress eventually demanded it. It's available to you now because a war ended and lawyers eventually won a fight. But the decision-making apparatus that authorized Popeye is still running. It's refined now. It's learned to move faster, to compartmentalize better, to make decisions in jurisdictions where disclosure is harder. The Environmental Modification Convention was signed in 1977. It's still in force. 48 nations are party to it. And no one has invoked it once to challenge another nation's environmental weapon. Not because no one's violated it. Because the mechanism for enforcement requires admitting you're investigating, which means admitting you know about programs you're not supposed to know about. The treaty works by silence. Systems don't panic. They adjust. But here's what the sources don't resolve. We don't know how much harm Popeye actually caused. The Kohler memo predicted crop damage, ecological disruption, and psychological trauma to civilians. The memos discuss unquantified effects outside the target zones. But there's no comprehensive casualty count, no study of long-term agricultural impact, no account of the people who died of hunger or disease after the rains disrupted planting cycles. The Pentagon Papers gave us the number of canisters, 47,409, but not the number of people affected, not the number of harvests lost, not the number of children malnourished because rice paddies were waterlogged in the wrong season. We know it happened. We know it was authorized. We know it was harmful. But we don't know the scale of the harm. And by now, 50 years later, we never will. The people who made these decisions are mostly dead. The people who suffered them mostly never documented their suffering. The data was classified and then lost. And this is the unforgivable part. Not just that it was done, but that its exact cost was never measured, because measurement would have required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would have required accountability. Systems don't panic. They adjust. And what gets